Can you believe we are on week 11 of the Effects on Violin series? This is happening really fast, y'all. This week we are talking about reverb. In this Effects on Violin series, every week we're going to hit a different effect. We'll give you some general information on that, some parameters, how to use it, and most weeks we will have a guest artist who is going to talk about how they use that particular effect in their music. This week we are talking to my friend Jesus Florido. A link to my discussion with him is up here in the corner. He's been doing this a long time and he's got a lot of really good things to say about reverb. It's worth a listen for sure. A note on this particular video, some of the differences between reverbs that we're going to be talking about are a little bit subtle. You're going to do better to hear those differences if you're using headphones or earbuds for this than just trying to use your iPhone speaker. And besides, a lot of this is going to be in stereo and, stereo, fancy. And you'll be able to hear those differences a lot better if you're using headphones, okay? Here is a quick demo of a dry sound with no reverb and a wet sound with some reverb. Reverb is one of those effects that we use to try to simulate something that happens in the real world, okay? So what is that thing that happens in the real world? Reverb or reverberations it's a naturally occurring phenomenon that happens because sound doesn't fly like a laser. It travels in all directions. Think more like a light bulb with no shade on it. That light's going in all directions and reflecting off the walls and the floor and ceiling. That's more what sound is like. So sound takes time to travel, like a noticeable amount of time to travel. Sound travels about 1 foot per millisecond. So if you and I are standing 10 feet away from each other, the sound that's coming straight out of my mouth and going right to your ears takes about 10 milliseconds to get there. But that sound is also traveling in other directions and bouncing off of things. And there may be some aspects of that sound that take 30 or 40 milliseconds to get to you because they took a circuitous route to get there. So you're going to hear a decay. You're going to hear the original sound, the sound waves that go straight from my mouth to you, but you're also going to hear all the sound that's been bouncing around that room, which is why, like in a big room, you clap your hands, you hear pa. Those are all reflections that are arriving to you through time, and it generally in a regular shaped room, you're going to get this gradual decay that's an exponential decay. In a fairly simple shaped room, that's what you're going to hear. So why do we use reverb on our sound? Well, we want to make it sound like we're in a space. That's a thing that our bodies are just way more comfortable with. We want to thicken up our sound. Thick is good, right? We want to add tonal complexity. So different sounds and frequencies, we want to add those to our sound to sound more complex. And we want to be able to control how far away we sound like we are in a mix. With a stereo field, you can control which direction that sound is coming from. With reverb, you can control how far back or how close to you it is. Your ears are really, really good at figuring out what type of environment you are in. And because sound and emotions are very tightly connected, that's why we're musicians, right? The different sounds that you hear have a big effect on how you feel. You feel very different if you're in a room with a lot of soft surfaces in it than you do if you're in a room with a lot of very hard surfaces in it. You may not realize that, but you do. So different things that your ears can tell. Your ears can tell what size of a space you're in. They can tell what shape of a space you're in, whether it is a simple shape or a very complex shape. Your ears can tell how close they are to the source of sound. Your ears can tell how hard the surfaces are in a room that you're in, and it can tell whether those textures, you can hear hardness and texture of the surfaces in the room. So what exactly are your ears listening for to determine all those things? If we know, then we can help create a mental picture just from our sound, because ears are so good at that. And if we're trying to evoke certain emotions, then if we understand how our ears hear different reverberations, then we can help convey the emotions that we're trying to convey. So, in order to determine how big a space you are in, your ears use decay time. They're trying to hear how long are those reverberations coming back to me, because that gives me an idea how far did that sound have to travel before it hit a wall and came back. So we do that, it's called decay time, and the parameter that we use to adjust that is in seconds or in milliseconds. So we're going to hear a quick demo here with a short decay time and a long decay time, and you'll hear that one sounds like a small room and one sounds like a larger room. This next one is a little more subtle. The shape of the space that you're in, if you're in a simple shaped room, it's a cube, any 4-year-old could draw that shape, then it's going to sound a certain way. That sort of logarithmic decay or exponential decay is going to happen. In a more complex shaped room, think a room with a bunch of alcoves and stuff in it, sound is going to get caught bouncing around in those things before it comes back. And the decay is not going to be as exponential. And we can simulate that by having multiple reverbs happening at the same time so that the overall decay you hear isn't just sort of that simple curve. And here's an example of that. All right, a little more subtle, but it's there, right? Proximity to source is a huge one. The parameter that we adjust is called pre-delay, and it has to do with how long after the original sound do we start to hear reverb. And you can envision this by thinking about the people that are sitting close to you. The early reflections, they're going to hear my voice coming straight at them, right? And then they're going to hear some reflections. How long between when they hear my voice is there a pause before they start to hear reflections? So we can adjust that by using pre-delay. I'm going to let you hear that here. All right, the next thing is the hardness and the texture of surfaces. And the parameter that we can adjust on most reverb pedals or units is going to be the tone or the frequency. And think about which frequencies are most prominent in reflected sound. If you're sitting in a room with wood floors and leather furniture and all that sort of thing, it sounds different than in a room with stone floors and tile walls and that sort of thing, because wood absorbs those higher frequencies, and carpet and leather and all those absorb higher frequencies. So the frequencies that come back to you are going to be more of the lower frequencies. Stone or tile or glass, they reflect those higher frequencies more than soft surfaces do. So you're going to hear a brighter reverb. So here's a demonstration of a bright reverb versus a dark reverb. All right, so there are sort of 3 common types of reverb, and I kind of group hall, chamber, and room together because they're all trying to simulate a space, okay? Plate is a separate type of reverb, and spring is another type of reverb, although it's related to plate reverb. So spaces, and then plate and spring, and I'll talk about why those are. So a hall, a chamber, a room, they're trying to mimic the sound of an actual physical space. And depending on which hall reverb or which chamber or which room or cathedral, or they'll call them different things. But they've taken into account the size, the shape, the material construction, all the things that we just talked about when they're putting that room reverb together. Parameters for those will include time, so you can determine how big that room is. The mix, how much of that reverb is blended with your dry signal. Is it mostly dry signal or is it mostly reverb? Tone is going to help determine the brightness or darkness of that reverb. So it's whether it's hard surfaces or soft surfaces in the room. Level is the overall volume of the entire blended signal, both the dry signal and the wet signal together. And then pre-delay is going to help us kind of determine how far away the sound source is from the listener. Okay, so those are those things. And here are some examples of what they sound like. All right, so that was a room, hall, cathedral, just any of the things that sound like an actual physical space. That's how that kind of reverb works. Plate reverb is a different thing. In the early days of studio recording, they didn't have digital reverbs and all that. They actually used a metal plate. What they would do is they would feed the signal electronically into a large metal plate. And that signal is going to be traveling through the plate. Some of it's going to go directly across. Some of it's going to bounce around inside that metal plate, just like sound does in a room. And then it will put a microphone, a contact microphone, somewhere on that plate. And where you put that contact microphone, how much voltage you're using, they have dampeners that they could use to sort of dampen that thing. All of those different parameters would change what that plate reverb sounded like. So that is what a plate reverb, the digital plate reverbs that we have now, they're trying to simulate what that sounded like when they fed that sound into like literally just a big metal plate. Now, the thing about those plates is they were big and they were heavy and they were expensive, and you could use them in a studio, but you couldn't really take one with you out on the road. You're not going to bring this 8-foot by 7-foot steel plate with you and stick it in the corner and, all that. So what is similar to a plate? Well, we can use a spring. We can actually take a long, skinny plate and coil it so it takes up less space, and then we can put it in a little tank and stick it in the back of an amplifier. And it basically works in a very similar manner to the plate, but there are some different sounds that come along with that. They generally have a darker tonality. And then if you've got a transient that hits that, say you chop, or like a guitar, you hit your pick real hard, you're going to hear that sort of springy sound. So asking, which one is the best reverb for me, it depends. It depends on what you want to hear. So you get to decide what sound you want. I would say there are a few common mistakes. One mistake is using too much reverb. One is using too little. And the third mistake that people use is not being picky enough about the reverbs that they use, or they just throw it in, and I'm not gonna monkey with the settings to get this thing to actually work in the context that I'm in. So too much reverb. We've all heard the people on YouTube that sound like they're playing in the bottom of a well. You can't hear anything that they're playing. All you just hear is I'm like, oh, okay, well, it sounds like a lot of reverb there, but I can't tell what you're doing. If you are playing lots of long, slow notes, you can get away with a lot more reverb. If you're playing something complex, if you're flying around doing some Paganini, then too much reverb can muddy your sound up so that nobody can actually hear what you're doing. Now, I suspect that some of these people on YouTube are doing that on purpose because they know that what they're playing isn't clean. So you can just cover it up with a bunch of reverb. But the problem is we all know that you're doing that. We all know. The other mistake people make is that they use too little. Violins sound best in big reverberant halls. Like people will play in a room and go, oh, the acoustics in here are wonderful. What they mean is that there's a bunch of reverb, right? So, and it's a nice reverb, right? So violins sound best in those places. If you play in your bedroom where it's carpeted and your bed's in there, lots of soft surfaces, it's a small room, your violin can sound kind of scratchy and thin and weak. And then you go step in your bathroom and you're like, oh my God, I'm amazing, right? That's because there's reverb in the bathroom. So if you use too little reverb on your instrument, it's going to sound anemic. And with a solid body, it's also going to sound like it's way too close. And you're like, whoa, we don't know each other like that. You need to put some reverb on that thing. The other one is that using the wrong reverb. Context is king. You have to know what context you're playing in to know which reverb is right for you. What does your instrument sound like? What does the rest of the mix sound like? What does the band sound like? A bright instrument might need a dark reverb on it, or vice versa. Sometimes you need a little less time, so it's not this pa, but you need more of it in the mix. So it's a pa, right? You've got more of that reverb, but it's a shorter decay. Sometimes you need more pre-delay to push that thing back, and we can have lots of reverb, but you're like, ba, right? So I'm getting that direct signal, but then I've also got a little something behind it to make it, oh yes, we are in a room. That's kind of nice. Where do we put reverb in our signal chain? Usually near the end, okay? If we put it at the beginning, then instead of feeding a clean direct signal to our distortions, to our pitch shifters, to all those different things, instead of sending bop, we're sending ba. And imagine that can kind of confuse some of the other effects, pitch shifters especially. So we generally put reverb near the end, although these are not rules. You can put them at the beginning if you want to. Just understand that it is going to affect the other things that come after it. And like we said before, you can stack your reverbs. And in fact, I recommend that you do. I use 2 or 3 reverbs on a lot of my patches. You generally, not a hard and fast rule, but normally you'd put the shorter ones first and then some of the longer ones after that. How to mix your reverb. Like EQ, you're going to have to adjust your reverb every night. So if you're playing outside, you're going to need lots more reverb. If you're playing in a gymnasium, remember your elementary school gymnasium, that, you know, the sounds that you made as a 5-year-old are probably still bouncing around in that room. You probably want to turn a reverb down, right? So you've got to listen and adjust your parameters on your pedal board. And a good person to ask is the front of house engineer. During sound check, you can ask them, hey, do you need a little more reverb? Do you need less? What do you need from me? Because they're out in the room and they can hear it. And they can definitely help you decide whether the reverb needs to go up or down. How do I audition a reverb if I'm trying to decide which reverb I want to use? Well, you heard me doing in all these clips was I would play sometimes some long notes, I would play some fast notes, and then there would usually be a chop in there. So I want to hear what that thickening effect is on the long notes. I want to play some quick stuff so I can ensure that there's still clarity. And then I want a chop or a sudden stop to be able to hear what does that reverb actually do? What does it sound like? So that's how I will audition a reverb. Some long notes, some fast notes, and then usually some chops so I can actually hear what the reverb is doing. You want to try that reverb with a bunch of your other effects on. Reverb after distortion is going to sound different than reverb after a clean signal. Again, you're also going to want to experiment with putting your reverb before your delay or after your delay. And then you might want more than one pedal. I might want a short reverb and then my delay and then a long reverb. I don't know. Maybe that's what's going to work best for you. Now, we've talked about sort of those 3 reverbs, the rooms, the plates, and the springs, but like anybody who's ever owned a Strymon knows that there are other types of reverbs. There's the fancy bougie reverbs, and I love those. There are a lot of different flavors. I would suggest that if you're recording, definitely use stereo reverbs. They're way different. And if you are using a stereo PA live, stereo delays and reverbs are really awesome. So here are a couple of these special fancy bougie reverbs for you. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that now you know more about reverb than you did, 20 minutes ago. And I hope that you also check out my interview with Jesus. Of course, you're here on our YouTube channel. Be sure to mash that subscribe button. The interview with Jesus. Check out some of our other videos, and look forward to seeing you guys next time.